March 1945. The Rhine River roared beneath a steel-gray sky, swollen with rain and the smoke of war. On its eastern bank, German officers stood in silence, their faces drawn tight as the thunder of artillery rolled across the valley. For months they had told themselves that this river, this ancient, mighty Rhine, would be Germany's final shield. Yet across the water, shadows moved with mechanical precision. American engineers, soaked and mud-caked, hauled steel beams through the chaos, driving pylons into the current under a hail of shells. Their bridge was rising, plank by plank, faster than German explosives could tear it down. The sound of hammers, engines, and shouted orders filled the air like a heartbeat that refused to stop. The officers watching from the far bank felt something break inside them, not from fear, but from disbelief. Every bridge they destroyed was reborn within days. Every explosion was answered by construction. And in that relentless rhythm, Germany's war began to collapse, not with a bang, but with the echo of bridges being built. In the first months of 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final brutal act. The once mighty Third Reich was collapsing from within. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied front in the Ardennes, had ended in failure. Thousands of German tanks lay burned in the forests of Belgium, their crews frozen beside them. The Western Front, once filled with confidence and propaganda, now trembled under the weight of retreat. For the first time, the German High Command understood that the enemy would not stop at the border. The Americans were coming, and the Rhine River stood as the last natural barrier between them and the heart of Germany. To the Allies, the Rhine represented far more than a river. It was a symbol of Nazi defiance, the threshold to Berlin itself. Crossing it meant piercing the Finn, all defense line, and forcing open the gates to the Reich. Every commander knew it would be one of the most decisive operations of the entire war. General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered a meticulous plan. An operation that would rely not just on firepower, but on logistics, precision, and speed. The Allied engineers, often overlooked beside the glamour of tank divisions or air forces, were now at the center of history. By February, the snow along the western banks had begun to melt, turning the ground into rivers of mud. The air stank of fuel and exhaustion. Columns of American and British units stretched for miles. Sherman tanks, trucks loaded with pontoon equipment, Bailey Bridge sections, and cranes ready to unfold like mechanical beasts. Behind them came the engineers, the silent backbone of the army, tasked with the impossible: to build under fire, to repair under chaos, and to keep the advance alive no matter the cost. On the German side, orders were as clear as they were hopeless. Hitler declared that the Rhine must never be crossed. "The Rhine is Germany's destiny," he said, his voice trembling with anger and delusion. Cities like Cologne, Koblenz, and Wesel were turned into fortresses. Bridges were wired with explosives, artillery placed on every hill, and anti-aircraft guns aimed both at the sky and the riverbanks. But Germany no longer had the strength to fulfill such commands. The Luftwaffe was shattered. Fuel was gone. Most divisions were under strength, filled with young boys and old men pressed into service. Still, the Germans clung to the river. For centuries, it had been a symbol of pride, a poetic border sung about in national songs. Now it became a line of desperation. Propaganda promised that no Allied soldier would ever step across it alive. But behind the speeches, German officers knew the truth. Supplies were dwindling, communications were failing, and the enemy's air power ruled every inch of daylight. When night came, it was no longer quiet. American bombers and artillery turned the darkness into a storm of fire. For the Allies, however, patience was key. Eisenhower refused to rush. He wanted all fronts coordinated, the British in the north under Field Marshal Montgomery, the Americans under General Omar Bradley in the center, and General George S. Patton driving relentlessly in the south. Each would strike the Rhine in sequence, crushing any hope of an organized German defense. But even with overwhelming power, The question remained: how to cross a river that stretched hundreds of meters wide, with bridges rigged to blow and currents strong enough to swallow entire tanks? The answer would lie in preparation and courage. American engineer battalions practiced for months, mastering the assembly of floating bridges, the laying of pontoons, and the art of rebuilding under fire. Their work was precise, mechanical, almost beautiful in its discipline. They built mock rivers across England and France, racing against time, learning to fight not with rifles, but with rivets and rope. What they didn't yet know was that their greatest test would come not from plans, but from fate itself, a chance encounter that would change the course of the war. For on the horizon, hidden in the smoke of retreating divisions, stood a bridge the Germans had forgotten to destroy. By late February 1945, the Allied advance stretched like a steel tide from the North Sea to the Moselle. The once terrifying German army was now a patchwork of shattered formations and improvised defenses. Still, along the Rhine, Hitler's command clung to a single belief: that the river would halt the enemy long enough for some miracle to occur. He spoke of new weapons, of secret divisions forming in the east, of loyalty and destiny. But even the most loyal officers began to see the truth written in the smoke rising from their cities. The Reich was dying, and the Rhine, its proud symbol, had become its coffin lid. To the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group prepared to strike near Wesel. He believed in perfection before action, weeks of preparation, stockpiling ammunition, and clearing the skies for the Royal Air Force. In the center, General Omar Bradley coordinated the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, their eyes set on Cologne and Remagen. Farther south, George S. Patton, relentless and impatient, drove the 3rd Army toward the Saar and Palatinate, vowing he would piss in the Rhine before anyone else crossed it. The rivalry among these commanders burned like an undercurrent of energy. Each wanted to be the first to breach the river that had defied conquerors for centuries. Behind the front lines, the scale of preparation was staggering. The engineers, quartermasters, and transport corps worked day and night, laying pipelines, repairing roads, and building supply dumps that stretched for miles. Trains brought endless convoys of fuel and ammunition, while engineers tested bridge sections under simulated artillery fire. Hundreds of floating pontoons waited under camouflage nets, their metal surfaces gleaming faintly under the cold spring sun. They would soon become the skeleton of the bridges that would carry tanks and men across the Rhine's raging waters. German defenses, though fierce in spirit, were hollow in strength. The Siegfried Line had already fallen apart under the pounding of Allied artillery. Many German units were reduced to half strength, and officers complained that they no longer had functioning radios. Hitler's orders to hold at all costs meant little when ammunition was running out, and every bridge demolition squad lacked explosives. As the Allies drew closer, the Wehrmacht blew up bridge after bridge, retreating to the eastern bank, leaving only ruins behind. But time, as it turned out, was against them. On the morning of March 1st, Allied reconnaissance planes reported something astonishing. Near the town of Remagen, south of Bonn, the Ludendorff Bridge still stood, damaged but intact. It had been built during World War I, a massive steel structure designed to withstand heavy traffic and bombardment. The Germans had mined it for destruction, yet for reasons of miscommunication, hesitation, or sheer luck, the charges had not been properly set. When the Americans saw it through the haze, disbelief turned to opportunity. Eisenhower's headquarters erupted in activity. Orders flashed down the chain of command. Secure the bridge at all costs. For the Germans, the discovery was a nightmare. Every bridge across the Rhine was supposed to be destroyed to delay the Allied advance. The fact that one remained standing meant a potential breach of the last defensive line. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, reacted with fury, sending frantic messages to local commanders. Demolition teams were dispatched. Artillery batteries were ordered to zero in on the bridge, and Luftwaffe squadrons were called to strike it from Tipots, air. But by then, the Americans were already moving. As word spread through the U.S. First Army, soldiers of the 9th Armored Division under Brigadier General William Hogue advanced rapidly toward Remagen. The march was grueling, broken roads, enemy fire, and desperate resistance. Yet morale soared when they heard what lay ahead, a bridge over the Rhine still standing. For them, it was not just a military target, but a symbol, the chance to end the war months sooner, to cross the line that no Allied soldier had reached since Napoleon. By March 6th, the Allied front stretched like a tightening noose around the river. Cologne fell, its once grand cathedral surrounded by rubble. German civilians streamed eastward, terrified and exhausted. For the soldiers defending the Rhine, the war had become a nightmare of orders without meaning, of retreat without rest. They watched the opposite bank fill with American armor, artillery, and bulldozers. Across the water, the sound of engines and hammering echoed endlessly. The Americans were preparing for something enormous, something final. In those days, the Rhine was no longer a boundary between nations. It was a race against time. The Germans tried to destroy what they could, but every explosion seemed to come too late. Every hour that passed, the Allies drew closer, faster, more determined. And as dusk fell on March 7, 1945, the unimaginable happened. The first American scouts reached Remagen and saw the Ludendorff Bridge stretching before them, silhouetted against the smoke-streaked horizon. Its steel arches, blackened by war, still touched both sides of the river. The Rhine had not yet been broken, but it was about to be crossed. War is often remembered for the generals who command it or the weapons that define it. But in the story of the Rhine crossings, the true heroes were men who fought with blueprints instead of bullets. The engineers of the U.S. Army had trained for years in relative obscurity, perfecting a craft that demanded precision under chaos. They were builders, not killers, yet their work would decide the fate of an empire. When the Western Front reached the Rhine, these engineers became the spearhead of progress. The bridge builders, the pontoon crews, the men with steel nerves and rough hands. They faced not just an enemy army, but nature itself. The river was wide and violent, fed by melted snow from the Alps. Its current could twist steel and swallow tanks. Every crossing attempt required timing, courage, and sacrifice. The human side of the Rhine crossings was one of exhaustion mixed with unshakable purpose. Most American soldiers by 1945 were veterans of Normandy, the hedgerows, and the Ardennes. They had marched through mud, survived endless artillery barrages, and watched friends fall beside them. Yet when the orders came to take the river, something changed. There was no hesitation. Engineers who had never carried rifles found themselves under direct fire, wading waist-deep into the current with cables, ropes, and beams. They joked through their fear, cursing the cold water, the mud, and the sound of German shells exploding upstream. To them, the Rhine was more than a military objective. It was the last barrier to going home. If they could build this bridge, the war would finally end. The German soldiers facing them were equally human, though trapped in a different kind of fate. Many were boys in their teens, drafted from Hitler Youth Camp, and given rifles too heavy for their shoulders. Others were men in their 50s, veterans of older wars, weary and broken. They had been told that the Rhine would save them, that no force on earth could cross it. But as they watched American engineers constructing under fire, something inside them began to break. Reports from German commanders described scenes of disbelief, soldiers staring silently across the river as the enemy built faster than they could destroy. "They are like ants," one officer wrote. "We shell them, we bomb them, and still they come." For the engineers, speed was survival. Every bridge had to be completed before German artillery could find its range. They worked without rest, guided by spotlights at night and smoke screens by day. When explosions tore holes in their work, they patched them within minutes. When sections sank into the current, They dove into freezing water to retrieve them. One officer later said that building across the Rhine was like constructing a skyscraper during an earthquake. Every plank laid meant a step closer to victory. Every connection secured meant another tank could roll across. The American command understood that engineering had become a weapon in itself. The ability to build and rebuild faster than the enemy could react turned the balance of power. The German military, though still capable of fierce resistance, simply could not keep up with the speed of American logistics. Bridges, roads, ferries, and pontoons appeared almost overnight. Entire divisions could move where the Germans believed no crossing was possible. It was warfare turned mechanical, industrial, unstoppable. The engineers had transformed the battlefield from one of defense to one of momentum. And yet, behind the steel and strategy, there was emotion. Many engineers wrote letters home describing their pride in building something instead of destroying it. "We are making bridges, not wrecks," one sergeant wrote to his wife. "Every time we put one up, it feels like we're undoing what this war has done." Others admitted their fear, confessing that working under fire was worse than combat because they could not shoot back. Still, they kept building, knowing that their work carried thousands of lives across the water. On the German side, that same determination was mirrored by despair. Generals sent frantic orders to demolish every crossing, to flood the banks, to hold at any cost. But their words meant little without materials or men to enforce them. Even the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, could do little but send a few outdated planes to strike the bridges. Most were shot down before reaching their targets. The sound of Allied bombers filled the skies day and night, while German anti-aircraft guns fired blindly into the clouds. By early March, both sides understood that the battle for the Rhine would not be won through brute strength alone. It had become a contest of endurance. One side building, the other breaking, both exhausted but unrelenting. American engineers became legends among their peers. Infantrymen spoke their names with awe, saying, "They build like madmen." German reports described them as machines without fear. And as the war pressed on, these men of iron and mud carried the weight of history on their shoulders. The Rhine crossings were not merely tactical feats. They were human achievements born from courage, will, and precision. Behind every plank and revet stood a man who had seen too much of war and yet chose to create rather than destroy. In those moments, under the smoke and thunder, the essence of victory was not conquest, but construction. The river that had divided nations for centuries was about to witness something extraordinary, a triumph of human ingenuity over despair. And that triumph would take its first breath at a place called Remagen. German generals sobbed when American engineers built Rhine bridges faster than they could destroy them. The story of the Rhine crossings cannot be told without understanding the sheer brilliance of Allied tactics that turned chaos into coordination. The crossings were not isolated miracles, but carefully orchestrated maneuvers linking engineering genius to battlefield precision. Every bridge built across the river had a purpose. Every movement was synchronized with artillery fire, air cover, and logistics flowing like clockwork. When American and British forces reached the Rhine, they didn't see a single obstacle. They saw hundreds of opportunities to strike, and they used every one. From a tactical standpoint, the Allies had mastered the art of flexibility. Instead of concentrating all power on one crossing, they created multiple potential points of attack. This forced the German command to scatter its defenses along hundreds of miles of riverbank. Deception operations kept the enemy guessing. Dummy bridge sections were floated downstream. False radio transmissions suggested crossings miles away, and night movements disguised the true points of assault. In the fog of war, this confusion proved devastating. German units often found themselves firing at empty stretches of river, while the real attack unfolded elsewhere. Artillery coordination was another key. Before any crossing began, Allied guns unleashed a thunderstorm of shells that blanketed enemy positions. The noise alone was overwhelming. Thousands of guns firing in unison, shaking the earth for miles. When the firing stopped, engineers and infantry moved instantly, racing to the banks before the Germans could recover. Smoke shells created thick curtains that hid their progress from enemy spotters. The precision of timing was remarkable. It was industrial warfare executed with mathematical rhythm, each component, artillery, air power, armor, and engineering, working as one living organism. Yet beyond tactics and weapons, the crossings revealed something deeper: the psychological collapse of German command. The sight of American bridges appearing overnight, massive structures that seemed to defy the destruction around them, shattered morale at every level. Reports from the front described officers breaking down in disbelief, soldiers refusing to fight, and entire units surrendering at the mere sight of Allied tanks rolling across new bridges. The German generals, long trained to believe in the superiority of their fortifications, now faced an enemy whose power lay not in static defenses, but in constant motion. The Americans didn't wait for orders. They built their way forward. For many Germans, the crossing of the Rhine marked the moment they knew the war was lost. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of Germany's most experienced commanders, reportedly said, "The Rhine has been crossed. The war is finished." Even the propaganda broadcasts could no longer disguise the truth. When Allied radio announced that troops had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the words struck the German public like a thunderbolt. The unthinkable had happened. The sacred river had been breached. Technology had made it possible, but human ingenuity made it unstoppable. The Bailey Bridge, one of the war's most revolutionary engineering designs, became the Allies' secret weapon. Invented by British engineer Donald Bailey, it was a modular, prefabricated structure that could be assembled by hand and carry tanks within hours. Its genius was simplicity. Lightweight panels that locked together like a giant puzzle. American and British engineers built thousands of them across Europe, transforming rivers and craters into roads. During the Rhine campaign, Bailey bridges and floating pontoons became lifelines, stretching across the river under enemy fire, carrying armor, ammunition, and supplies without pause. The Germans had no answer to such speed. Their own engineers were skilled, but by 1945, they lacked fuel, materials, and time. Where the Americans built in hours, the Germans could only destroy in minutes, and often not fast enough. Luftwaffe attempts to bomb the bridges failed repeatedly. Pilots flew outdated planes with little fuel, often facing walls of anti-aircraft fire. In desperation, Germany even deployed V-2 rockets against the bridge at Remagen. But their inaccuracy turned the effort into tragedy, rather than triumph. Not a single missile struck its target. As the Allies expanded their footholds, engineers continued to defy expectations. Temporary bridges became permanent arteries of war. Some were so strong that entire armored divisions crossed them within a day. Others were rebuilt multiple times after being struck, often while still under artillery fire. The courage of those who worked on them defied logic. One officer recalled that the only thing louder than the shelling was the hammering of engineers who refused to stop. Leadership, too, played a defining role. Eisenhower's calm strategy held the coalition together. He understood that engineering speed could end the war faster than any battle of attrition. Bradley's pragmatism ensured every bridge was defended, every crossing reinforced. Patton's audacity turned engineering into spectacle. He pushed his men across the Rhine in just one day using floating pontoons, fulfilling his vow to cross before breakfast. Montgomery, ever meticulous, built the largest and most complex crossing in history at Wesel, involving thousands of vehicles, tanks, and soldiers moving with mechanical precision. Each approach reflected the personality of its commander, yet all shared one goal: to break the back of Nazi Germany once and for all. The moral angle of this chapter in history is profound. The Rhine crossings revealed not just victory through destruction, but triumph through creation. Engineers turned devastation into structure, chaos into rhythm. They proved that courage was not only found in those who fired weapons, but in those who built hope amid fire and ruin. The Germans fought for survival. The Allies fought for completion. The difference was visible in every bridge that rose from the smoke. By the time the first tanks thundered across Remagen, the world understood that the end had begun. Germany's rivers, once its greatest defenses, had become pathways for its conquerors. The soldiers who crossed them did not shout or cheer. They simply moved forward, relentless and silent, driven by the knowledge that every mile built, every beam placed, brought the war one step close, to its final breath. And on that smoky afternoon of March 7th, 1945, the decisive moment arrived. The Americans reached the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, and history crossed the Rhine. The morning of March 7th, 1945, began like countless others on the Western Front, gray, damp, and heavy with the sound of artillery. But by noon, the course of the European war would change forever. As units of the U.S. 9th Armored Division advanced through the hills south of Bonn, their patrols stumbled upon a sight no one expected: a massive steel bridge still spanning the Rhine. Through the haze of smoke and shell bursts, they saw the dark outline of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, its towers standing like ghosts over the river. The discovery was so unbelievable that the first reports were met with disbelief at headquarters. Every German bridge across the Rhine was supposed to be destroyed. Yet here it stood, damaged but intact, guarded by a few panicked defenders. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, a young officer leading one of the forward elements, could hardly believe his eyes. He turned to his men and said simply, "That's the Rhine, boys." For the first time in modern history, Allied troops faced the river that had defied invaders for centuries, and there was a way across. Timmerman radioed his discovery to command, and within minutes, orders came down: seize the bridge before the enemy can destroy it. What followed was one of the most daring, chaotic, and heroic assaults of the entire war. The German forces at Remagen, under Captain Willy Bratke, were in shock. They had received demolition orders days earlier, but lacked the proper detonators and explosives. The charges placed along the bridge's girders were incomplete, damaged by Allied bombing, and poorly connected. Engineers frantically worked to repair the circuits as American tanks and infantry began descending on the western bank. At 3:00 p.m., Bratke gave the order to blow the bridge. A blinding flash erupted, followed by a thunderous explosion. But when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. The blast had damaged the roadway but failed to destroy the main structure. The cables held firm. The arches remained intact. The Germans had just watched their last line of defense survive its own destruction. On the American side, the opportunity was too great to waste. Artillery fire intensified, pounding German positions on the eastern bank. Infantrymen sprinted down the road toward the bridge, bullets snapping past them, shells bursting overhead. Machine guns rattled from both towers as snipers picked off engineers attempting to cut demolition wires. The air was filled with dust, smoke, and the deafening roar of river currents below. It was like running through a furnace. One soldier later recalled, "You didn't think, you just moved." At 3:50 p.m., the first American troops set foot on the bridge. They crawled across the damaged planks, dodging twisted steel and live wires, returning fire as they advanced. German engineers tried one last desperate attempt to detonate the charges manually, but it was too late. The Americans were already halfway across. Tank destroyers opened fire on the eastern bank, suppressing enemy guns. Combat engineers followed behind, cutting wires, throwing damaged explosives into the river, and patching the bridge under fire. Every step forward was agony. Every meter gained was history in the making. By 4:00 p.m., the first platoon reached the opposite side. The soldiers, covered in mud and soot, stormed the eastern tower and captured the remaining defenders. Within an hour, the Ludendorff Bridge, once Germany's proud industrial marvel, was in American hands. The impossible had happened. The U.S. Army had crossed the Rhine. The men on both sides could hardly comprehend it. American soldiers cheered, wept, and stared in disbelief at what they had done. German prisoners stood in silence, their faces hollow. The river that had guarded Germany for 1,000 years had been breached not by a grand offensive, but by a handful of engineers and infantrymen acting on instinct and courage. Back at headquarters, news of the crossing spread like wildfire. Eisenhower's staff refused to believe the initial report. Only after repeated confirmations did they realize what had occurred. "They've taken a bridge intact," one officer whispered. The words carried the weight of victory. Eisenhower, though cautious, immediately ordered reinforcements to exploit the breach. "Hold it at all costs," he commanded. Engineers were rushed to the site from across the front, bringing steel reinforcements, cranes and pontoons. Within hours, the bridge became a lifeline, funneling troops, tanks, and supplies across the Rhine before the Germans could regroup. But the victory came at a terrible price. German artillery began bombarding the crossing from every available position. Shells landed on the bridge constantly, sending splinters of steel and concrete into the air. The engineers worked relentlessly, patching holes, replacing planks, and repairing cables as the structure shuddered under the strain. At night, searchlights and tracers lit the sky, turning the river into a scene of chaos and fire. "It looked like the end of the world," an American sergeant wrote, "but we just kept crossing." For the German command, the loss of Remagen was more than a tactical disaster. It was psychological devastation. The Rhine, once thought invincible, had been violated. Messages flooded Hitler's headquarters, each more desperate than the last. The Führer's rage was uncontrollable. He demanded explanations, arrests, and executions. "The Rhine has been lost because of cowardice," he shouted, pounding his fists on the table. To him, the crossing at Remagen was proof that fate had turned against Germany. For his generals, it was the moment they realized the war could no longer be won. And as the night fell over Remagen, the bridge still stood, shaking, burning, alive with movement. The impossible crossing had become real, and history had shifted. The seizure of the Ludendorff Bridge sent shockwaves across Europe. In the Allied lines, it was greeted with disbelief, then exhilaration. In Berlin, it struck like thunder, an unbearable humiliation. For years, Nazi propaganda had declared the Rhine to be Germany's eternal barrier, the sacred line that no foreign soldier would ever cross. Now, within a single afternoon, that illusion was shattered. Hitler's fury consumed everyone in his path. Orders were sent out for courts-martial, arrests, and executions. Entire chains of command were accused of treason or cowardice. Officers who had tried in vain to destroy the bridge were dragged before military tribunals. Some were shot. Others took their own lives before facing the inevitable. In the Führer's bunker, the Rhine crossing was seen not just as a defeat, but as a betrayal of destiny. For the soldiers and engineers on the ground, there was no time to celebrate, and the crossing was only the beginning of a new and deadly phase. As thousands of American troops poured across the river, German artillery zeroed in. The hills above Remagen erupted with gunfire. Heavy shells slammed into the bridge's superstructure, tearing holes through its steel and concrete. The Luftwaffe, though weakened and desperate, launched attack after attack. Jets, dive bombers, even gliders laden with explosives. The skies over Remagen turned into a storm of flame. Yet, miraculously, the bridge endured. Every time a section buckled or caught fire, teams of engineers rushed forward, welding, replacing, reinforcing under fire. They worked without rest, often ankle-deep in water, surrounded by smoke, shrapnel, and the dead. "You didn't think about dying," one engineer said later. "You just thought about keeping that bridge alive." The Germans threw everything they had into destroying it. They used V-2 rockets, artillery, and experimental jet planes. Nothing worked. Their aim was poor, their timing worse, and the Americans refused to stop crossing. The bridge became a living artery of war, carrying tanks, trucks, ambulances, and men toward the heart of Germany. Every hour, hundreds of vehicles thundered across, the structure groaning beneath their weight. Engineers monitored every vibration, praying that it would hold. It was a battle between destruction and creation, fought with wrenches and dynamite instead of rifles. For the men of the U.S. 9th Armored and the engineers of the 51st and 291st Battalions, Remagen became a legend, written in sweat and blood. They patched the bridge with steel plates scavenged from wrecks, used wooden beams as replacements for girders, and dragged wrecked vehicles off the road to keep the crossing clear. The smell of oil, cordite, and burnt metal filled the air. Every minute felt borrowed. "We were standing on history," said one lieutenant, "and we knew it could blow any second." Behind the lines, Allied commanders moved with lightning speed. Eisenhower ordered entire divisions to exploit the bridgehead, turning a small foothold into a massive assault corridor. Patton, ever competitive, fumed that the 9th Armored had stolen his thunder. "By God, if they can cross there, I'll find my own way across," he snapped. Within days, other crossings began, north at Wesel, south near Mannheim. The Rhine, once thought uncrossable, was being bridged in multiple places. The psychological barrier that had protected Germany for centuries was gone. The enemy was inside. For German civilians watching from nearby villages, it was a scene of disbelief. Many had fled to the riverbanks to see the bridge collapse in flames, as their leaders promised it would. Instead, they watched American convoys roll steadily across, the stars and stripes fluttering in the smoke. Old men wept openly. Women clutched their children. For them, the sight meant the war was over. The heart of Germany was open, and there was no longer any place to hide. At the same time, in Allied propaganda broadcasts, the crossing was hailed as a miracle of courage and engineering. Newspapers around the world carried the headline, "Americans crossed the Rhine at Remagen." Soldiers who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Siegfried Line read the news with pride. The end, they felt, was finally within reach. Yet on the ground there was little sense of triumph. The bridge was shaking apart. Each day it carried more weight than it was ever designed for. Massive support cables snapped one by one under the constant strain. Engineers could hear the deep groans of twisting metal like the breath of a dying giant. On March 17th, 10 days after the crossing began, the inevitable happened. Without warning, the central span of the Ludendorff Bridge gave way. The entire structure lurched, shuddered, and then collapsed into the river with a roar that echoed for miles. Soldiers on both banks froze in horror. Dozens of engineers working on the bridge plunged into the Rhine. Many were pulled out alive, but 28 men were killed. The bridge that had defied bombs, shells, and rockets had finally succumbed to its own exhaustion. The survivors stood silently, watching the debris drift downstream, a monument to human endurance and sacrifice. Yet even in its destruction, the bridge had done its duty. By the time it fell, thousands of troops and vehicles had already crossed. The Americans now held a firm bridgehead on the east bank, supported by pontoon bridges hastily thrown across in the days before. The Rhine had been breached. The fall of the Ludendorff was no defeat. It was the final act of victory. Its collapse marked the end of Germany's last natural defense. In the following days, as the smoke cleared, German prisoners were marched past the wreckage. Some stopped and stared, unable to speak. "It was then we knew," one captured officer said later. The war was lost. For the American engineers who stood beside him, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. They had done the impossible, and paid for it dearly. The Rhine had been crossed not by grand strategy or overwhelming firepower, but by courage, ingenuity, and relentless determination. And though the Ludendorff Bridge was gone, its legacy would live on. Proof that even the strongest barriers can fall when human will refuses to break. When the echoes of the collapsing Ludendorff Bridge faded across the Rhine Valley, the war's tempo shifted forever. What had begun as a desperate struggle for a single crossing became a tidal wave of Allied momentum. Within days, engineers erected new pontoon bridges beside the ruins. Wide, flexible platforms made of steel pontoons and timber planks that floated like lifelines across the river. Trucks, jeeps, and tanks rumbled across them day and night, guided by lanterns and hand signals. The Rhine, once a mythical barrier, was now nothing more than a waterway under Allied control. By late March, entire divisions were streaming through the bridgehead. Patton's Third Army surged across the river further south at Oppenheim, while Montgomery's forces crossed in the north near Wesel. The Rhine frontier, which German generals had promised to defend to the last man, was collapsing at every point. Allied command reports described the situation with restrained satisfaction. The enemy is in full retreat, resistance is scattered and disorganized. But in the German heartland, the emotional shock was immeasurable. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than geography. It was identity. In every German schoolbook, every patriotic song, it symbolized the boundary between civilization and chaos, between the fatherland and its foes. The phrase, "The Rhine is Germany's soul," had been repeated like a prayer. And now, that soul had been pierced. Newspapers in neutral countries described German officers openly weeping at the news from Remagen. One Swiss reporter wrote, "It was as if an entire nation's heart broke at once." In army headquarters, the mood bordered on despair. Hitler's rage reached a fevered pitch. He ordered the immediate court-martial of every officer connected to the Remagen sector. General Major Richard von Bothmer, commander of the local forces, was sentenced to death. So was Major Scheller, the officer in charge of demolitions, despite evidence that he had tried repeatedly to destroy the bridge but failed due to faulty explosives. In total, 5 officers were executed. Their deaths did nothing to restore the crumbling morale of the Wehrmacht. On the contrary, it deepened the hopelessness. "We were dying for a bridge that no longer existed," one surviving soldier later recalled. While the German command turned inward with paranoia and blame, the Americans pressed forward. The Remagen bridgehead grew into a massive operational base. Bulldozers flattened the surrounding terrain into airstrips and supply depots. Medical tents stretched across the fields, serving a constant flow of wounded men from the crossing operations. Engineers, exhausted but relentless, constructed 4 additional floating bridges within sight of the Ludendorff's ruins. The Rhine, once a symbol of permanence, was now a place of constant motion. Filled with the rhythmic hammering of steel and the roar of engines, the Allied advance accelerated beyond all expectation. Once across the Rhine, there was no stopping it. Columns of tanks rolled eastward toward the industrial Ruhr, Germany's vital heart of coal and steel. By early April, the Ruhr pocket had been sealed, trapping over 300,000 German troops, an entire army group within its confines. Many surrendered without a fight, stunned by the speed and precision of the Allied push. The victory at Remagen had made the difference. It gave Eisenhower the foothold he needed weeks earlier than planned, allowing the Allies to converge on central Germany with unstoppable force. Meanwhile, behind the lines, the American engineers who had kept the bridge alive for 10 crucial days were being celebrated as heroes. Newspaper correspondents visited the site, walking among the twisted wreckage, taking photographs of the surviving bridge towers jutting from the river like blackened teeth. Time magazine published a front-page feature titled, "Bridge of Victory." But among the engineers themselves, there was no boasting, only a quiet respect for what they had achieved. "We didn't win a medal," one said simply. "We built a road to Berlin." On the German side, defeat bred disillusionment. Many officers who had served loyally since Poland now realized the war was lost. Letters intercepted by Allied intelligence spoke of despair and guilt. One colonel wrote to his wife, "I stood on the east bank and saw the Americans crossing the Rhine. I could not fire. My hands would not move. It was the end of everything we were taught to believe." The Rhine, the final shield of the Reich, had become a grave for its ideals. In Berlin, propaganda officials struggled to spin the disaster. Radio broadcasts referred to the Remagen crossing as a temporary breach and claimed that enemy forces are being contained. But no one believed it anymore. Refugees fleeing westward see aired the truth in their faces. Families broken, soldiers without weapons, towns reduced to ash. As the Allies advanced, the myth of German invincibility dissolved. Even the SS divisions, once symbols of fanatic loyalty, were now retreating or surrendering en masse. Still, despite the chaos, there were flashes of tragic bravery. In isolated sectors, German engineers tried to replicate the Americans' efforts, throwing together makeshift bridges or ferries to evacuate trapped troops. Many died in the attempt. Others were captured, stunned by the realization that the enemy's engineers could build faster under fire than they could destroy in defense. That contrast, more than any battlefield defeat, broke their spirits. By the end of March 1945, the Rhine crossings were complete. What had taken Germany years to prepare had been undone in mere days. The Allies now stood deep inside the Reich, their path to the Elbe River wide open. American, British, and Canadian units were closing in from every direction. The once proud Wehrmacht was in fragments, and for the first time since 1939, the German people could hear the war approaching, not in distant echoes, but in the thunder of tanks rolling through their homeland. From that moment onward, the collapse of Nazi Germany was not a question of if, but when. The fall of the Rhine defenses marked the beginning of the end, the moment when even the most loyal officers realized that Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year empire had drowned in the river that was meant to protect it. In the weeks that followed the collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge, the Allied advance across Western Germany unfolded with unstoppable momentum. The Rhine, once hailed as Germany's eternal shield, had become a corridor of defeat. From Remagen to Wesel, Allied convoys streamed eastward day and night. The thunder of engines never stopped. Across endless roads, long columns of tanks, artillery, and supply trucks rolled deeper into the heart of the Reich, their headlights cutting through the smoke of burning towns. The final stage of the European war had begun, not as a fierce standoff, but as a relentless pursuit. The Americans used the Remagen bridgehead to drive north toward the Ruhr, while Patton's Third Army advanced eastward across central Germany, liberating towns at breathtaking speed. British and Canadian forces in the north crossed near Wesel and swept toward Hamburg. For the German army, the war now resembled a collapse rather than a defense. Communications were broken, fuel was gone, and the Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective force. Entire divisions vanished from the front lines. Many surrendered without firing a shot, their officers carrying white flags or simply walking toward the American tanks with their hands raised. At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower watched the reports flow in, each one confirming the same story. The enemy was disintegrating. By early April, the Allies had sealed the Ruhr pocket, surrounding more than 300,000 German troops. Inside, the trapped soldiers fought with dwindling supplies, scavenging food from abandoned villages. General Walter Model, once hailed as one of Germany's most capable commanders, now found himself encircled with no hope of relief. Refusing to surrender, he disbanded his army and took his own life in a forest near Duisburg. His death symbolized the final unraveling of the German command system. Meanwhile, at Remagen, the Rhine's east bank transformed into a vast logistical base. The once deadly battlefield now echoed with the sounds of cranes, trucks, and bulldozers. Engineers built permanent roads and ferries, while field hospitals treated a constant stream of wounded men. The wreckage of the Ludendorff Bridge still jutted from the river like broken ribs, a stark monument to both destruction and victory. Soldiers passing by would stop to stare at it, some saluting silently, others whispering prayers for the men who had died keeping it standing. The engineers who had survived the ordeal were reassigned to new projects, their work now crucial to keeping the front moving east. Many never fully recovered from the exhaustion or trauma. They had fought their war with steel and sweat, and the Rhine had taken its toll. For the German people, the sight of American engineers building bridges faster than their army could destroy them became a haunting metaphor for the end. Cities once considered invincible strongholds, Essen, Dortmund, Düsseldorf, fell in rapid succession. Civilians watched in silence as Allied columns moved through their streets. There was no cheering, no resistance, only numb surrender. "We no longer feared death," one civilian recalled later. "We feared the silence after it." In Berlin, the atmosphere was one of panic and denial. Hitler refused to believe that the Rhine had truly fallen. When generals presented him with reports from Remagen, he accused them of lying. He still spoke of miracle weapons and new fronts that would reverse the tide. But no miracle came. The last German counterattacks along the Rhine collapsed almost instantly. Every attempt to destroy Allied bridges failed. By now, the Reich was fighting on fumes, its soldiers exhausted, its factories in ruins, its airfields cratered beyond repair. The once mighty machine that had terrorized Europe was now broken beyond recognition. Allied soldiers crossing the Rhine could feel the difference. The resistance that had once seemed endless was fading into confusion. They were advancing through ghost towns, where houses stood empty and church bells hung silent. Occasionally, sniper fire cracked from a window, but more often, the only movement came from civilians carrying white cloths or wandering aimlessly through rubble. "It was like walking through the shell of a dead world," wrote one American sergeant in his diary. "The river felt behind us like a door closing forever." Yet amid the ruins, there were moments of humanity. At one crossing point near Bonn, American engineers paused to help German villagers repair a water line destroyed by shell fire. Children gathered around, watching curiously as the same men who had built bridges for invasion now helped rebuild what war had taken away. For a brief moment, the Rhine, once a line of division, became a symbol of connection. The strategic consequences were immense. The Rhine crossings allowed Eisenhower to deploy his forces with unparalleled flexibility. From the bridgeheads, he could thrust in multiple directions at once, north toward the Baltic, east toward Leipzig, or south toward Bavaria. Within a month, Allied tanks were rolling into the Elbe Valley, linking up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. The trap around Germany was closing. The Third Reich, which had once stretched across Europe, was being crushed from both sides. For the engineers who had made it possible, their triumph was not in medals or headlines, but in the quiet understanding that they had helped end the bloodiest war in human history. They had faced the impossible, bridging a river under fire, keeping a structure alive against all odds, and turned it into victory. One commander later said, "We didn't win the war at Remagen, but we opened the door to peace." As April turned to May, and the Allied armies converged on Berlin, the Rhine crossings faded into history. Yet their impact endured. The bridge that had stood only 10 days before collapsing had done more than connect two shores. It had connected the beginning of the end. It symbolized the moment when technology, courage, and persistence outmatched tyranny and fear. When news of Germany's surrender reached the men who had built and defended the bridges, many were already moving homeward. Some had no strength left to celebrate. Others simply sat by the river's edge, watching the water flow past the ruins, its surface calm once more. For them, the Rhine was no longer a line of war, but of memory. The great river that had witnessed centuries of conflict had finally seen peace return, and with it, the quiet dignity of those who built bridges, not just between lands, but between the end of destruction and the beginning of rebuilding. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the Rhine once again became a river of peace. But it was not the same river the world had known before. Its waters had carried the weight of a collapsing empire, and its banks bore the scars of a nation divided by faith, fear, and ruin. Yet, amid that desolation, it also carried the story of human endurance, of men who built when the world around them was breaking. The crossing at Remagen was more than an act of engineering. It was the moment when ingenuity triumphed over arrogance, when steel and courage defeated ideology. The American engineers who assembled their bridges under fire proved that wars are not only won by those who destroy, but also by those who create. Every girder they raised, every plank they laid across the Rhine, was a declaration that progress would outlast despair. For the German officers who watched helplessly from the eastern bank, the sight of those bridges rising faster than they could demolish them was unbearable. It was not merely a military failure. It was the crumbling of belief. They had been taught that the Rhine was eternal, that it would never be crossed by an enemy's boots. When it fell, they saw not just a river breached, but the death of an illusion that had fueled a decade of madness. Some wept not out of loyalty to Hitler, but because they finally understood what their country had lost. History often remembers wars through their victories and defeats, but the story of the Rhine reminds us that history also turns on acts of resilience, the quiet, tireless work of those who build under fire. The men who fought and died there did not see themselves as heroes. They were engineers, soldiers, workers. Yet their bridges carried the weight of an entire generation's hope for an end to war. Today, the ruins of the Ludendorff Bridge still stand in Remagen as a memorial. The river flows calmly beneath it, indifferent and eternal. But to those who know its story, it whispers of courage, the kind that does not shout, does not destroy, but endures. The Rhine was crossed, the war was ended, and humanity, scarred but unbroken, began to rebuild.